Hello, men. It's great to be back here with you again as we continue our study through Christ Formed in You. This week we're going to be in chapter 10, and it's called Training in the Spirit. And it's going to be talking about the importance of spiritual disciplines, identifying what they are as well as what they aren't. And one of the examples that the book starts with is the example of a musician. You know, when somebody is beginning as a musician, you don't start them off with the most advanced things. We have a music academy or a fine arts academy here at our church called the South Metro Fine Arts Academy. And right now we teach all of our kids how to play instruments, how to sing, how to be musicians. And we don't start them off with the most complicated toccatas and fugues by Bach. We don't start them off with a classical sonata by Beethoven. Now, we could, but they wouldn't last very long. Ultimately, what we start them with is these basics of learning scales, learning fingerings, learning where the notes are on the piano, how to read music. And it's just years and years of basics building up to these things where one day they will get to do the advanced stuff. But first, they have to start with these basic disciplines before they can move on to the deeper stuff, to the harder stuff. You know, what makes them a professional, I guess. You know, that's one of the things that causes a lot of artists to scratch their head when somebody says, you just have all this natural ability. Really, natural ability doesn't have a lot to do with it. It's the years of discipline and doing the right things that have gotten them to the point where they are now. Now, this has a lot in common with our spiritual journey. We have these things called spiritual disciplines. And if you go to page 204, there's this cool little diagram that has all these different spiritual disciplines that you can go through and that you can kind of look at for yourself. But before we do that, I really want to dive into what the meaning of spiritual disciplines are, what they're really meant to accomplish in our lives. On page 208, I want to read what the author says here. Remember that the purpose of spiritual disciplines is to form you more and more into the image of Christ, so that you will reflect His worth and glory to others through a life of love. And again, 204 just kind of gives that example of what spiritual disciplines are functionally and practically. But notice that the author said that it's all about forming us more into the image of Christ. And one of the ways that we become more like Christ is doing the things that He did. Another thing the author said in this chapter that really struck me is that there is not a single spiritual discipline that Jesus practiced that isn't available to us today. If you think about it, Jesus prayed, He meditated on God's Word, He spent time alone with Him, He fellowshipped with other believers. Those are things that we all have available to us today. And if we're going to pursue the likeness of Christ, we have to pursue the things that He did. And these spiritual disciplines is part of that. We meditate on God's Word. We spend time with Him in prayer. We go to church. We fellowship with other believers. But the important thing to remember about spiritual disciplines is that these things are not an end in and of themselves. Now, what happens whenever we start performing these spiritual disciplines as kind of a spiritual to-do list, it becomes legalism. It becomes a source of pride for us where we think that we can come to God and show off all the things that we have done in His name. But that's not what spiritual disciplines are about. And one story that was highlighted was in Luke chapter 18. And I want to read this to you. It's Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. So let me read this to you. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank You that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The more that we practice these spiritual disciplines, the more that we learn about Christ and how to bear His image, the more it should lead us into a realization of how much we are in need of God's grace See, the moment that these spiritual disciplines become about legalism and self-sufficiency, we've really completely lost the focus of what these spiritual disciplines are about, what we're supposed to be doing with them. And again, I want to quote the author again because I just thought that this was so profound the way that he put this. The purpose of spiritual disciplines, along with helping us to bear the image of Christ, it's also to cultivate an ongoing communion with God that allows us to display the gospel and Christ image in all areas of our life. That's the purpose of spiritual disciplines. It's not to make us proud or so that we can check off the list of things that we've been doing in God's name. It's ultimately about fulfilling God's purpose to bear His image to the world and to effectively share the gospel and to also cultivate a consistent communion with God in our everyday lives. So men, I hope that you enjoy your time together today. I hope that your discussions are glorifying to God and edifying to each other. Have a blessed day.